First of all, I want to welcome you all to this Co-Create seminar, and especially warm welcome to Shuchi, who's going to be visible in just a moment, I suppose. I will say a few words on the idea of the seminar series in the Co-Create project first, to set the scene, and then I'll hand it over to Shuchi to share her reflections and backstory and vision for the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, or short DSG. So first off, the idea of the seminar series, and I'm going back here to the term seminar itself to contextualize this, is to really to plant the seeds, the thoughts for ideas that can grow into something bigger than they would normally if we had those ideas just within ourselves, within individuals, you know, in our little desks, on our desks, on our sort of regular day-to-day work. The idea here is actually through the exchange in such a seminar, we come to better and broader and more grounded ideas, and that may take time, but it's about the exchange itself. So the notion of an ongoing dialogue, a Socratic dialogue, argumentative dialogue, which is based on asking and answering questions, and really to have a bit of a joint thought process in doing that. And so we've had internal seminars so far within the Co-Create consortium. I'm not going to introduce the project itself too deeply. I think you can read up and or also ask questions about it through the discussion. Briefly, I mean, the headline statement is obviously that it's about figuring out potential elements for governance of SRM research, solar radiation modification research, and to do that through a number of angles, both disciplinary, but also diverse perspectives from stakeholders. And so this seminar iteration, which is opened up to participation by stakeholders, are interested individuals, now is a step towards that, and actually inviting thoughts and comments from a broader range of people. And so as the dialogue is about asking and answering questions, I want to sort of preface perhaps the talk by Shuchi with those three guiding questions, which we may come back to later in the discussion as well. And that's around the question of the reasons, the different plural reasons and roles for and of public engagement or participation in the process of SRM research. What might be a missing ingredient or plural missing ingredients for SRM research at the landscape level to be a healthy ecosystem, and that's situated within broader ecosystems or societies around the world. And finally, how can researchers in this space and civil society organizations most constructively engage with one another? So that just to set the scene, and I will let Shuchi introduce herself and stop the screen sharing so that she can also, if desired, share slides.
Thanks so much for having me today and to chat about these really important topics. So I'm excited to dive in. So to briefly introduce myself, I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. Before that, I was leading the carbon dioxide removal portfolio in the Biden administration, focusing on justice and sustainability. DSG is an organization focused on the intersection of justice and governance dimensions of solar geoengineering, and really trying to focus on how to think critically about how to empower climate vulnerable communities in deliberations on this topic. I decided to build this organization kind of in the context of a few different core ideals. And first is that climate justice is global. Second, that governance must be early and inclusive. And third, people should be empowered to speak for themselves. And so these are some of the ideas I'm going to talk more about in my presentation. So first, I kind of wanted to set the stage and give some context about what's happening in solar geoengineering right now. It's going to be repetitive probably for a lot of people, but I kind of just wanted to build a cohesive landscape and set this foundation for the audience. So first, solar geoengineering is receiving a lot of growing attention in media. We're seeing a lot of integration of solar geoengineering into climate discussions in different ways, in different publications around the world. A lot of this media is centered in the global north, but we're also seeing media pick up in different countries in the global south as well. We're also seeing a lot of intergovernmental bodies and assessments engage in this topic. We've seen SRM come up in IPCC, 4 or 5 different UN reports, and most significantly, we saw SRM come up at the 6th UN Environment Assembly earlier this year. At UNEA 6, we saw new countries coming to the table in a big way across Africa, across Latin American countries, across small islands. And we also saw SRM come up in the UNEP Global Foresight Report earlier this year. I think third, we're also seeing countries that are increasingly engaging in solar geoengineering research and as well as funding it around the world. I think most significantly, the United States, the UK, EU, Canada, India, China, we're seeing this kind of growing interest kind of take hold in a lot of different countries. But that looks different in different ways, right? In the United States, we both have the White House engaging with a research plan, but we also have funding, versus in Canada, we've seen it come up in very small ways in potential science and environment agency plans. And so the way this evolves and how is looking very different in different places. We're also seeing a really fast rise in private sector involvement. I think a lot of people know about the different players in this space, but I think most significantly, there's a group called Make Sunsets, which are 2 rogue actors in the United States claiming deployment. We also have a startup from Israel called Stardust, which is also wanting to potentially deploy in the near term. But there's very little transparency about what these actors are doing. They're not following any norms or standards of scientific research in this space. We're also seeing for the first time venture capital investment in a for-profit context, and it's becoming extremely problematic. The last thing I want to mention is that we're seeing outdoor activity growing around the world, whether that's in terms of actual experimentation or proposals to do so. We're seeing that expansion across sectors. So in academia, so university proposals, public proposals, private and civil society engagement in those outdoor activities. I think significantly there's no coordinated research governance for these outdoor activities, so they're all following different protocols, if any. And so we're seeing continued testing of ring cloud brightening in Australia. We've also seen 2 canceled US experiments, both in California from the University of Washington and ScopeX from Harvard University this year alone. We also know that Make Sunsets is actively releasing aerosols in the stratosphere. We know that Stardust is conducting outdoor experimentation, and that's just what we know. And so I worry about what we don't know as well. So in that context, I want to give some kind of background on some of the challenges that I see in solar geoengineering. Many of these facets are known to the folks listening, but these are a few things that I want to emphasize and are by no means all encompassing. So first, we know the field is extremely global north centric. Engagement in the global south is sparse and is quite limited in scope. We know most research and activity is also based in the global north. We have some efforts that are growing on trying to shift that dynamic and trying to kind of build more engagement in climate vulnerable communities, but those are minor. And I think compared to the money flowing in the global north, those dynamics are not going to change as rapidly as some and especially me would hope. We have extremely limited governance. We don't have any formal governance on the international level across the research and development spectrum. Awareness and research remains low. That engagement is also geographically uneven in terms of how we're trying to build governance, and which creates a problematic environment in trying to build inclusion and in trying to build engagement. Third, we have a huge lack of civil society involvement. Civil society across all regions have either been unable or unwilling to find pathways to engage, which leaves the space really empty of constructive civil society voices. And civil society is key for a lot of really important reasons, which I'll get into in a bit. But we need them to build policy, to hold governments accountable, and to really actually build kind of the systems that we need to govern this technology. And the last thing I'll mention is that solar geoengineering is deeply contentious, which is the main driver of how it's perceived. I think it builds a lot of risk around engaging this field at all, which then makes it hard to build a legitimate and constructive dialogue around both governance and research. I think we see a lot of different, I think, loud voices on opposite ends of the advocacy spectrum, both in saying that we shouldn't even talk about this topic, and on the other end of saying we are going to need this to, save the world, if you will. But we're not really getting to center the voices in the middle of the spectrum, and to lift up new voices that, should be highlighted in how this debate unfolds. And so taking all this into consideration, I wanted to really distill the overarching gaps in the field into three main areas, which are knowledge, participation, and decision-making. So first, foundational knowledge in solar geoengineering science, policy, and governance is deeply needed. This is a major gap across the global north and south, and is going to require a lot of resources. But the ability to engage in international forums and discussions on this topic is only possible through an informed set of participants across sectors and across a deeply diverse set of countries. Next is participation. We don't have processes for robust public engagement, which is going to be needed for multiple sectors at a range of scales to serve different purposes. This includes things like co-developing research and policy priorities, participating in different types of decision-making processes, and understanding regional needs. And finally, we don't have any decision-making frameworks for solar geoengineering. We have to work to collaboratively build equitable structures that are capable of making binding rules and agreements for both research and deployment. These gaps are all deeply linked to one another, and the ability to achieve more just outcomes, to build public trust and legitimacy in research, is deeply dependent on all of these areas being successful. And these are the gaps that led me to found DSG. So DSG has a mission to work towards just and inclusive deliberation on research and potential use of geoengineering. And to kind of move towards these goals, we have kind of 5 different aspects to our theory of change. And so I'll just kind of go through them quickly and then go into some of those pieces in more detail right afterwards. So first is to build sustained governance capacity for civil society and other policy actors in climate vulnerable communities. Second, is that we want to build and empower policy engagement by building pathways for civil society from the knowledge that we have built from governance capacity in arenas where governance and decision-making are evolving quickly. Third is that we want to foster connections and collaborations between the global south and north, especially in civil society, to increase understanding of diverse perspectives. Fourth is that we want to contribute to external processes to ensure that principles of justice and inclusion are centered. And lastly, we want to expand the solar geoengineering narrative to help de-risk engagement for civil society organizations, to build transparency, and to build a platform for other types of voices to engage in the conversation. So one thing I want to focus specifically on for this talk is public engagement. And I think it's extremely important to emphasize here that engagement is incredibly complex. I think we often hear research institutions, policymakers, or organizations using these types of terms easily or without context, but I think it's important to name that engagement is not a singular thing and takes incredible and careful effort to do well. And so first, I want to explain that engagement across different communities is required for a lot of different reasons, but from my perspective, it's really required to understand how SRM would not just impact physical systems, but social systems. We need a much deeper understanding of how impacts might relate to the different ways people live and function. And the only ways to do that is to involve them in the processes that are taking place. So as I mentioned, engagement can look incredibly different for different needs or processes. An engagement process for a specific experiment will look quite different from the engagement processes needed to build a public research program. It's really important to consider these needs when thinking about what's necessary to require for a certain process. In the context of building these out, we have to be wary of not impeding important work or creating like overburdensome requirements, which is a really challenging line to find. I think with all this in mind, there's also a really core component of engagement that often gets overlooked, which is building the knowledge and capacity needed to enable meaningful participation. And I think this is kind of one of the key things that we're trying to address first in DSG. Having the knowledge to be able to engage is actually a really critical step that we often miss when we're doing things like survey work or asking communities to give their opinions on a specific experiment. And building that knowledge in unbiased ways and making sure that they feel empowered to actually want to engage in such a process is a really critical part of any engagement process. And it's kind of necessary to enabling people to speak for themselves. And I don't really think that's what we're seeing in solar geoengineering today. And I think broadly achieving that legitimacy requires asking really important questions when you're designing any kind of process, which is who has power, who's building and sharing information, who's designing a process, who's funding it, who's facilitating it. And these are going to be really important questions that participants will likely ask about. And the last thing I'll mention in this context is one of the biggest challenges, and I think most critical questions that comes up in public engagement is around who should be engaged. And the answer to that is going to be deeply dependent on what a process is and what its goals are. But building local partnerships to understand who publics are and stakeholders are, what their historic roles have been, and the context in which they interact is going to be really critical to understanding outcomes. And in the context of who you're engaging, I think one word that comes up a lot for solar geoengineering is the word vulnerable. And I think it's a really important word to highlight because I think the climate vulnerable have the most to gain or lose from use or non-use of solar geoengineering, from knowledge building in solar geoengineering. And we also have to think about kind of what that means as we evolve this field. We have to also really think about historically marginalized communities who have been disempowered in climate governance thus far, and how we want governance to kind of proceed in solar geoengineering and how that might look different than climate governance historically. And I think in the context of, globally impactful technology like solar geoengineering, understanding the Venn diagram of all these different types of communities for different purposes is really challenging. And I think we don't necessarily have answers on how to grapple with outcomes of engagement processes. And, for example, if an Arctic indigenous community was in favor of outdoor experiment versus a global South community might not, what is a fair process to move forward? And I think answers to these kinds of questions are not ones that we've started to grapple with because we've been in the stage of trying to design processes and make sure that governance processes exist at all. And I think moving past that to what good governance can be shaped as is going to be really critical to see this field succeed in a legitimate way. And so that kind of brings me to talking about civil society and why that's a deep focus for DSG. Civil society, I think, is a really key sector, an important one that can often be excluded when we talk about governance. We often focus on researchers and governments, but civil society plays this really important kind of central and middle role in policy. We have seen in multiple countries around the world that policy gets built, gets incubated in civil society organizations. And civil society is also not just one thing. We can think about civil society as think tanks, as advocacy organizations, as all different kinds of institutions, and oftentimes they get lumped together as a singular type of entity, which they are not. And I think civil society can play a really important role where states are not yet ready to engage in policy. And so civil society can establish, forms of governance, make recommendations for policy around solar geoengineering when countries are not yet ready to step into this space. Civil society can also act as a conduit for communities and for different types of groups to engage in policymaking. We see civil society as conduits for community engagement around the world in all different ways, not just in climate change and energy, but in a human rights context and in democracy context. And we have so many different types of worldviews that civil society can be inclusive of. And the last thing I'll mention is that civil society can also be a holder of kind of important views and processes in the context of political volatility. We are seeing and have seen that governments and political institutions can be extremely volatile, and that can undermine, consistency and dedication to building out these structures. And civil society can potentially be a place where a lot of this work can exist. And so overall, I kind of wanted to wrap up with just talking about what we need moving forward and kind of what that means for building legitimacy. I think first we have to acknowledge that uncertainties and unequal distribution of impacts are inevitable at SRM. And I think that will really affect the way we talk about governance, the way we think about research, and the ways that we can build trust with different types of communities. As I mentioned probably 12 times now, capacity building is extremely important across all types of institutions and geographies to actually enable engagement in this space. Third, I think we can really only work with entities, including funders, that are unconflicted and fully committed to moving greenhouse gas emissions reductions forward, to moving adaptation forward. And I think this is going to be really critical to public perception and kind of how the field is perceived within the broader climate community. I personally think that we need coordinated research governance from small scale experiments to actually build successful outdoor experimentation processes. We've seen for ScopeX, we've seen in California that the lack of an understood governance structure, the lack of publicly trusted process can lead to cancellation of experiments, to unsuccessful projects. And without having a coordinated body in place where standards are understood, it's going to be not just problematic for communities and for people where these experiments are taking place, but for scientists. Scientists aren't decision makers. They aren't necessarily going to know the political nuances of the work that they're doing, but they also shouldn't have to be decision makers. We should have processes in place that they know they need to abide by so that they can actually build the infrastructure they need to be able to kind of build the processes for good public engagement and for good governance. I think we also need to actually develop a much more wide-ranging communication portfolio in SRM. It has to be focused on a lot of different things, but I think thinking about transparency, science-based education, platforms for new types of actors, and talking about kind of ignored topics is going to be really important for how people perceive this space. And lastly, I think we really need to enable radical transparency. I think one of the reasons I bring this up is because we are seeing a lot of work that we don't necessarily know about until after the fact. And I think this kind of brings up another issue which relates to kind of coordinated research governance, which is the notion of codes of conduct. And I think that comes up a lot in Solar Geoengineering research governance. But I think they're insufficient. I think they're inherently self-regulatory, which means we don't necessarily know what we don't know. And at these different, kind of levels of work, not having this radical transparency could really lead to a diminished research field and diminished support and demand for understanding solar geoengineering impacts, for understanding the potential benefits of solar geoengineering. And so I think we're really going to need to think about what that type of principle will look like in practice. So just kind of also kind of give a little bit of sense of the work that we've done so far. We're very young, we've only existed for a little bit over a year. But we're in a few different countries, and we've so far engaged with over 100 civil study organizations and policymakers, which have largely been new to SRM. And I think the underlying message that I want to convey to this group is that demand, incentives, and activity are all shifting really rapidly, and not necessarily the same direction in different places and different communities, but that SRM is, the momentum behind it is moving in different directions by different people, and making sure that we have a good understanding of what that looks like, and making sure that we're actually engaged in shaping a lot of these different outcomes is going to be really important. I think oftentimes for SRM, and because of the history of this space, we stay in the scholarship space. But we have to also move beyond that to applying the scholarship and applying a lot of these principles to doing important work on the ground, and with just engaging with people. And as a researcher, it's incredibly hard. It's a completely different environment to actually try and do this work in a way that I know will inevitably have a lot of failures throughout it. But I really hope that more people come to kind of the space of actually trying to put into practice the principles that we've talked about for so long. So I will end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this really fully packed overview, and really a lot of substance there. Perhaps yeah, more than a decade worth of really discussion, I think, around this issue of participation and engagement in the SRM space.